Hello everyone. I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about the safety and effectiveness data for the new Pfizer coronavirus vaccine. This is the vaccine we will hopefully be rolling out to the medical center within the coming weeks. And I wanted to go over basically some of the information that has been announced regarding the vaccine. First, I want to go over the timeline, and this has been exceptionally rapid in terms of vaccine development. The epidemic was really announced to the world the very first of this year, back on January the 9th. And on January 21st, we had the first U.S. case identified. And by the 31st of January, this was recognized by the World Health Organization as a public health emergency of international concern. Vaccine planners started to develop their vaccines immediately when this was noted to be such a significant infection. And by March, we had our first patient arrive here at UT Medical Center on March the 9th. And just a week later, the first phase 1 vaccine trial was able to launch. And a phase 1 vaccine trial is where they have just a few dozen volunteers that take small doses of an experimental vaccine to see if it's safe and to basically look at their basic responses to the vaccine. That was a very limited trial. From March through the summer, they began to plan their large-scale vaccine studies. And in July, on July 27th, the first phase 3 vaccine trial launched. And phase 3 trials are where you seek to vaccinate large numbers of people, generally in the tens of thousands, and see if the vaccine actually works. And you also look at safety data as you're doing these large-scale studies to see how well tens of thousands of people will tolerate these new vaccines. At the same time, in the summer, manufacturers began to actually produce large volumes of the vaccine, tens of millions of doses. And normally, the manufacturing process waits until you know if the vaccine works or not, so you don't waste a lot of money manufacturing a lot of vaccine dosages. But the vaccine manufacturers worked in agreement with the U.S. government so that they would pay them for the manufactured doses even if they didn't work and they had to throw them all away. This was a way to make sure the manufacturers wouldn't lose all their investment in this technology. So while the studies were going on, the manufacturing plants were already producing tens of millions of doses of vaccine. So over the course of the summer, many people experimented in these trials. There were about 43,000 participants in the Pfizer trial that led to the vaccine that we will be using here at the medical center. About half of those received just a saline injection or placebo. The other half received the active vaccine. Another company called Moderna was testing a very similar product, and they also studied theirs in tens of thousands of participants with the same kind of study design. What we learned in November, we received very encouraging data from these vaccine trials. Pfizer was the first to release their results from the phase 3 study, and it showed that their vaccine was well over 90% effective at preventing coronavirus infection. And so that is leading this vaccine to be reviewed by the FDA for an emergency use authorization to make that vaccine available to us as healthcare providers in the near future. I wanted to just mention briefly how this vaccine works because this is brand new technology. These are called nucleic acid vaccines. And vaccines that we're used to taking, like the flu vaccine, are basically flu virus that has been grown in chicken eggs that you then inactivate or kill, and then you inject the dead flu virus into someone and it produces an immune system response. And sometimes that's a limited immune system response because it doesn't replicate or mimic the natural viral infection process like some of the other vaccine technologies can. Another way you can do this is to use a live virus so that the virus will go in and infect cells and you weaken it a little so that it can't cause disease. But we don't really have that as a technology with coronavirus vaccines. And those vaccines can have some risk, and so they decided not to pursue that, at least initially. But the vaccine candidate that has been studied most currently with the Pfizer product is what's called a nucleic acid vaccine. And this is essentially a little piece of genetic information that instructs your body how to produce one of the proteins that's found on coronavirus. You inject the vaccine into your body, that nucleic acid goes into your cells, and your cells produce small amounts of the protein target for the coronavirus. And this is typically something that's on the surface of the virus that your immune system can recognize. It's not the entire virus, it's just a little piece of it. And so the immune system recognizes that protein being produced by your cells and develops a very vigorous response to that protein so that it can later prevent you from becoming infected with actual coronavirus by blocking that protein on the surface. And so it's a good way to basically train your immune system how to respond to something it's never seen before, so that the first time you're exposed to coronavirus, your immune system is already prepared and ready to go and ready to respond to that virus. Just to talk to you about the data, the most recent data released by Pfizer from November the 18th reviewed 43,000 study participants. And again, half of them received vaccine, half received a placebo injection of saline. This was a very well-balanced study. 42% of the participants were from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds globally. And so it gave a good representative sample of the population of the planet that we're seeking to protect with this vaccine. And it also included 41% of the subjects were in the 56 to 85-year-old demographic, the group of people that are suffering the most from severe or possibly fatal coronavirus illness. And so it included a lot of subjects in that population to make sure it worked in the people that needed the protection the most. What they saw is over a few months of this trial, there were 170 coronavirus cases that developed in trial participants. And 162 of those occurred in people that received the placebo injection, and only 8 happened in vaccine participants, which showed that this vaccine worked exceptionally well. It was 95% effective at protecting people from illness with coronavirus. It also was demonstrated that the effectiveness happened in all ethnic groups. Regardless of the background of study participants, what country they were from, or their ethnicity, the vaccine worked equally well across all populations that had been studied. And then finally, in the older population, it was still 94% effective. It basically had the same response in people over 65 years old as it did in younger participants. And so this was very encouraging data. Another thing that people have concerns about with vaccines, or any new product, or really any medication we take, is it safe? Does it work is important, but also, is this a medication that's safe for me? And one of the really encouraging findings from this trial is with tens of thousands of participants, there were no serious safety concerns identified. There were no reactions that were severe enough that required patients to have to go to the ER or go to the hospital for medical care. So it didn't harm anyone in terms of side effects that are significant. There were some adverse reactions, and we have these with basically any medication we take or any vaccine. Fortunately, the adverse reactions were mild, and they only lasted a day or two. And the most common things that were identified, and these are what they call in the vaccine study grade 3 reactions, which means the reaction is so bad that I just couldn't leave home that day. I had to stay at home and let this run its course, and then the next day I felt fine. But about 3.8% of the people in the trial had fatigue for about a day that was so severe they stayed at home, and that's a pretty small population. 2% of the people in the study had a headache that was severe enough that they stayed home. So very low numbers, but it's important to note that if you get these symptoms after the vaccination, they're only going to last a day or so, they're going to go away, and they're going to be of no long-term consequence. In terms of how many people developed milder side effects, ones that happened, you didn't feel so good, but you were still able to go to work, still able to go about your activities. They haven't published the full list of side effects from the phase 3 trial yet for those more minor reactions, but we can get a good idea looking at what happened in the earlier studies of several hundred participants, the phase 2 studies, in terms of those side effects. What we saw is that fever was fairly common. About 17% of trial participants in the younger age group developed a fever as high as 102 degrees Fahrenheit. So 17%. That's almost 1 in 5 when you vaccinate a large number of people that are going to have a fever. The older you got, the less likely you were to have a fever. And that's because older subjects' immune systems just don't respond as vigorously to a vaccine or an infection. So they only had fever about 8% of the time, or right at 1 in 10. Pain at the injection site was the most common symptom, and anyone that's had a flu shot or a tetanus shot or anything else knows that your arm hurts for a few days after getting a vaccine. That's because your immune system reacting to that vaccine just causes these inflammatory cells and inflammatory molecules to accumulate. It's a good sign, actually, because it means your immune system's responding to the shot that you've had. And so pain happened in 80 to 90% of the subjects. So that's a very common symptom. Other symptoms that were more mild that were described in those phase 2 studies included things like mild fatigue, mild headache, just not really feeling like yourself for a day or two. But all these symptoms resolved again in a couple days, and people were back to their usual activity. So what we can expect as we roll out this vaccine at the hospital is largely this is going to be a safe vaccine for us. Tens of thousands of subjects, no major serious adverse events. But you are going to experience some side effects. You're going to have a sore arm. You might get a fever that you need to take Motrin and just take it easy for a half a day or a day until these side effects wear off. But before long, you'll be able to return to your normal activities without any long-term side effects of the vaccine. So the Pfizer vaccine product is what we are slated to receive here at UT Medical Center. And the reason we're going to get this instead of the Moderna vaccine, which will probably be approved soon, is that the Pfizer vaccine ships in very large quantities per unit. The minimum shipment size is 1,000 doses. So only large institutions that are capable of providing vaccine to a large number of people can use this without risking wasting it. It also requires very low temperature storage, and we're one of the few facilities around that has the freezers capable of storing a vaccine like this until it's ready for use. And so that's another point in our favor for getting this vaccine. Finally, it's a very similar product to Moderna, so regardless of which one an institution gets, if some people are working at a facility that gets Moderna vaccine, it's very similar technology, has very similar effectiveness data, and it has very similar side effect profiles. They're basically equivalent. And so it doesn't really matter if you're at a facility that gets Pfizer or gets Moderna. It's essentially the same product in the end and generates the same kind of immune response. In terms of planning, when we start rolling this out, this is going to be logistically complicated. We have thousands of employees that we're looking to offer vaccine to. This requires 2 injections, and they need to be as close to 21 days apart as we can get them. And so it will require some advanced planning and scheduling to make sure we get the initial dose and the follow-up dose planned for all of our folks when we start rolling this vaccine out. If you want to read more about these vaccines, I included a link. The Infectious Disease Society of America has a web page that continually updates with safety and effectiveness information on these vaccines. It also has a list of all the publications. So if anyone wants to read more or just take a deep dive into the data themselves, this is a great page that summarizes all of the publications on the currently available or soon to be available coronavirus vaccines. Thank you very much.